Welcome. Welcome to this Unitarian Universalist Church of Idaho Falls, August 21st. My name's Victoria McDonald, and I am the worship associate assisting our Reverend Kevin Carson. Welcome to everyone, and glad you're here. So, announcements. The calming room sounds like a good place to be. In the nursery is now available for caregivers of small children to take them upstairs and settle them during the service. Caregivers must stay with their children. The room is unstaffed. Please follow the signs from the sanctuary to find that room. Our second announcement is about coffee. So Unitarians apparently seem to be very connected to the drinking of coffee. It gives us energy to discuss the serious business. And today, Davette has arranged a coffee hour. She's worked very hard. I think she was here at 6 o'clock this morning. And she needs volunteers. She would like to have 4 people. She can give them directions on how to set up and clean up. For those of us who were here before COVID, we had 2 miracle workers. They were called Sadie, and they were named Sadie and B, and they were here every Sunday without fail. They did a marvelous job. B is now in Lincoln Court, and I think Sadie is home taking care of her husband. So please sign up to be a volunteer or find someone. If we don't get volunteers, I'm sure that we'll all be happy with water and maybe saltine crackers downstairs. So it's up to you. So next is ringing the Peace Bowl. This is your chance, our chance, to breathe deeply. So when I ring the Peace Bowl, breathe deeply in. When I do it with yoga, I breathe in to the count of 4, hold it for 4, release it for 4, and hold it out for 4. And it becomes, you can do a mantra when you're doing that. So take advantage of a chance to breathe deeply and to calm yourself. please join with me in reciting the words of our covenant that's found in your order of service. Love is the spirit of this community, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And on to our chalice lighting. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning in celebration of the life we share together. Words by Christine Robinson.
Good morning. Our call to worship this morning comes from the words of Anne Frank. In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I simply can't build up my hopes on a foundation consisting of confusion, misery, and death. I see the world gradually being turned into a wilderness. I hear the ever-approaching thunder, which will destroy us too. I can feel the suffering of millions, and yet, if I look up into the heavens, I think it will all come round right, that this cruelty will end, and that peace and tranquility will return again. In the meantime, I must uphold my ideals, for perhaps the time will come when I shall be able to carry them out. I invite you now to enjoy our opening hymn, number 360, Here We Have Gathered.
Here we have gathered side by side, circle of kinship, come and step inside. May all who seek here find a kindly word. May all who speak here feel they have been heard. Sing now together this our heart's own song. Here we have gathered, called to celebrate days of our lifetime, matters small and great. We of all ages, women, children, men, infants and sages, sharing what we can. Sing now together this our heart's own song. Life has its battles, sorrows and regret, but in the shadows let us not forget. We who now gather know each other's pain. Kindness can heal us, as we give we gain. Sing now in friendship this our heart's own song.
Today's Time for All Ages is The Hungry Dog, a Buddhist story. There was a great king who oppressed his people and was hated by his subjects. Yet when the Tathagata came into his kingdom, the king desired much to see him. So he went to the place where the Blessed One stayed and asked, "O Sakyamuni, canst thou teach a lesson to the king that will divert his mind and benefit him at the same time?" And the Blessed One said, "I shall tell thee the parable of the hungry dog. There was a wicked tyrant, and the god Indra, assuming the shape of a hunter, came down upon the earth with the demon Matali, the latter appearing as a dog of enormous size. Hunter and dog entered the palace, and the dog howled so woefully that the royal buildings shook by the sound to their very foundations. The tyrant had the awe-inspiring hunter brought before his throne, and inquired after the cause of the terrible bark. The hunter said, "The dog is hungry," whereupon the frightened king ordered food for him. All the food prepared at the royal banquet disappeared rapidly in the dog's jaws, and still he howled with portentous significance. More food was sent for, and all the royal storehouses were emptied, but in vain. Then the tyrant grew desperate and asked, "Will nothing satisfy the cravings of that woeful beast?" "Nothing," replied the hunter, "nothing except perhaps the flesh of all his enemies." "And who are his enemies?" anxiously asked the tyrant. The hunter replied, "The dog will howl as long as there are people hungry in the kingdom, and his enemies are those who practice injustice and oppress the poor." The oppressor of the people, remembering his evil deeds, was seized with remorse, and for the first time in his life he began to listen to the teachings of his righteousness. Having ended his story, the Blessed One addressed the king, who had turned pale, and said to him, "The Tathagata can quicken the spiritual ears of the powerful, and when thou, great king, hearest the dog bark, think of the teachings of the Buddha, and thou mayest still learn to pacify the monster." The end.
Joys and concerns. Our first concern is from Layla. John Tanner is in Bronson Advanced Cardiac Hospital in Kalamazoo, Michigan, with heart failure. The pig valve he had inserted 15 years ago failed. They may insert another one. This next concern is mine. My sister-in-law, Rena, and her two sisters are dealing with the imminent death of their 96-year-old mother. She was a loving, kind mother and will be greatly missed. Two joys from Molly. She's been watching hummingbirds in her backyard. And Friday was Molly and Tom's 44th wedding anniversary. Good deal. Davette's has the last joy. She is thankful that my friends give her joy, all of them.
And let us hold all those joys and concerns which we are not ready to share at this time. One of my favorite quotes from the popular theologian John Dominic Crossan is about taking the Bible literally. He said, "It is not that those ancient people told literal stories and we are now smart enough to take them symbolically, but they told them symbolically and we are now dumb enough to take them literally." And for many people, even today, this is unfortunately still the case. Yesterday's story has become today's Holy Scripture. And this is true even for stories that clearly seem to be fictional lessons, such as the book of Job and the book of Jonah, which are two of my favorites from the Jewish tradition. Job is an excellent example of Jewish wisdom literature, and Jonah is just a great story that describes one way of imagining the human-divine relationship and explores the idea of justice and fairness. In the Hebrew Scriptures, Jonah is considered one of the 12 so-called minor prophets, and there's also a brief version of the Jonah story in Surah 37 of the Islamic Quran, where he is known by the Arabic name Yunus. He is the only one of the minor prophets mentioned in the Quran by name. It is unlikely that the Jonah described in the story has any historical reality, but it is possible that there was a prophet named Jonah with whom the story became associated. Scholars believe the biblical text of Jonah was written during the period after Jewish exile in Babylon, probably between the late 5th and early 4th century BCE. There's a brief mention of Jonah, the son of Amittai, in a passage in 2 Kings where he is described as a prophet in the northern kingdom from the town of Gath-Hepher, a few miles north of modern Nazareth. There's also mention of Jonah in the apocryphal book of Ecclesiasticus, which was written around the year 190 BCE, so we know the story was already in circulation, at least by then. If a real prophet named Jonah existed, he would have been a contemporary of King Jeroboam II, dating him to around 786 to 746 BCE, when the northern kingdom of Israel was divided from the southern kingdom of Judea, each with a different ruler. According to tradition, Jonah was buried in the city of Nineveh, which is featured in the story. The ruins of this ancient walled city are located across the Tigris River from the modern city of Mosul in northern Iraq. And this archaeological site is now among the world's most threatened because of the ongoing conflict with ISIS. Jonah's alleged tomb was considered a pilgrimage site for Sunni Muslims, so in July 2014, it was blown up and obliterated by ISIS extremists. If you're only vaguely familiar with the story of Jonah, you probably know the part about him being swallowed for 3 days by a whale or large fish, as it's described, before being spat out by the grace of God to do his bidding. This makes for great storytelling, and it has been popular for millennia. Jonah's 3 days in the belly of the fish became a popular allegory for death and resurrection in the imagination of early Christians. And you can see many artistic interpretations of the story on the sarcophagi of wealthy Roman Christians, such as the image on the front of your order of service this morning. Most sermons you're likely to encounter on the book of Jonah focus on this resurrection theme or being obedient to God. In fact, if you've read the book Moby Dick, there is a sermon like this described early in the book, delivered by the character Father Mapple. In the book, Father Mapple ascends a rope ladder to a pulpit shaped like the prow of a ship to give his sermon filled with delightful nautical imagery in the Seamen's Bethel Chapel in New Bedford, Massachusetts. This is actually a real place you can visit, and it has been serving the community of whalers and fishermen since it was founded in 1830. The memorial plaques that line the walls, dedicated to the local mariners who have been lost at sea, attest to the dangerous work done by generations of fishermen and women. If you eat seafood, consider saying a prayer of thanksgiving the next time you enjoy the bounty of the sea in their memory. The current ship's prow pulpit was later added when the chapel became the set for movies and a popular tourist attraction. I have to admit, I have wanted to preach in that pulpit since I first saw it on a visit. Maybe someday we can get a prairie schooner pulpit or something here. But aside from the ordeal with the large fish, there is much more to the story of Jonah, despite being only 4 chapters long. One of the main themes is about being obedient to God and the reach of God's power. And the other is about justice and fairness and the human desire to see for ourselves the justice or perhaps vengeance we think is due. With such broad theological themes, it is no wonder that the book of Jonah is also a common scripture read in synagogues on Jewish high holy days. So to set the stage for part 2 of my sermon today, let me give you a condensed recap of the story with some selected passages. I would highly recommend reading the full book of Jonah sometime when you have a chance. The story begins with God calling on Jonah to go to Nineveh and warn the city's inhabitants of the coming judgment of the Lord due to their wickedness. Instead of obeying God's instructions, Jonah decides instead to hop on a boat and run away to Tarshish, which is in present-day Spain near the Strait of Gibraltar, at the other end of the Mediterranean Sea, a journey of about 3,000 miles. Why does he do this? As he later reveals, Jonah did not want to warn the Ninevites because he did not want to see them spared God's wrath. He thought he could simply put plenty of distance between himself and the city so that, caught unaware, the hated Ninevites would be certain to perish, hopefully in some horrible fashion, I'm sure. Maybe a pillar of fire or being swallowed up by the earth or something like that, an old-fashioned wrath of God smiting they deserved. But as the story unfolds, Jonah soon learns that he cannot run far enough. God thwarts his attempt to flee and then decides to teach him a powerful lesson. Tossed overboard by the frightened crew in an effort to appease an angry God, he is swallowed up by a large fish and miraculously remains undigested for 3 days and nights while he ponders his situation. Jonah then cries out to the Lord for deliverance, and it is easy to see how the following passage has resonated with those who felt swallowed up by despair over the centuries. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God, from the belly of the fish, saying, I called to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. How shall I look again upon your holy temple? The waters closed in over me. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. Hearing his prayer and knowing his contrition to be genuine, it says, Then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it spewed Jonah out upon the dry land. Jonah is back where he began. And as Paul Harvey used to say, and now for the rest of the story. And yes, I am old enough to remember Paul Harvey. This time, Jonah obeys God's instructions to go to Nineveh and announce the imminent wrath of God. Walking through the city, Jonah cries out, probably with a great feeling of satisfaction, 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. But do the wicked Ninevites dismiss his message as the ranting of some crazy prophet? No. They immediately begin to repent for their wicked ways, fasting, covering themselves, and even their animals in sackcloth and sitting in ashes. Even the king joins in on this citywide act of contrition. They face up to their wickedness and think, who knows, God may relent and change his mind. He may turn from his fierce anger so that we do not perish. Jonah is suddenly the most successful prophet in history. If only it was so easy to speak truth to power and get such results. Much to Jonah's consternation, his worst fears come to pass. It says, when God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil ways, God changed his mind and about the calamity that he said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. You can just imagine the thoughts that would run through Jonah's head. Where is the justice, Lord? The Ninevites are so wicked. They simply must be punished. Bring on the wrath. It says he grew so angry, he pleaded for God to let him die rather than living to see the Ninevites spared. Sitting outside the city in his makeshift booth, what we might call a lean-to or hut, he pouts and stews in his anger. So, of course, God tries to give Jonah some perspective. He causes a bush to grow up miraculously, which provides Jonah with some shade for a day. But the next day, God causes the bush to wither, sending Jonah into another fit of anger. He gets so angry, he again exclaims he would rather die than live like this. The demise of the bush is simply more than he can stand. This is, of course, the teaching moment that God has prepared for Jonah. The story ends with God saying, "You are concerned about the bush, for which you did not labor, and which you did not grow. It came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should I not be concerned about Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also many animals?" Like any good Jewish teaching story, the book of Jonah ends abruptly, with God giving Jonah, and really us who are listening, a point to ponder. In the ancient midrash spirit of the rabbis, we are left to interpret the text and debate whether or not Jonah got the message, whether he could understand why God could forgive the Ninevites rather than destroy them despite their wicked past, how the guilty could go unpunished. We're not even told why Jonah hated the Ninevites so much, though there was plenty of intertribal violence and animosity in those days. God mentions their wickedness as the reason they're facing imminent destruction, so we must assume that Jonah's anger was at least a righteous anger. We must assume that the Ninevites had wronged Jonah or his people in some way, and his thirst for justice was a reasonable human response. Who among us cannot sympathize with Jonah? When we see moral atrocities today that go against everything we value, do we not also thirst for justice? Children massacred in schools, innocent people murdered and horribly maimed by those hoping to advance some twisted political agenda, the abuse of the poor, genocide, or the senseless extermination of an entire species due to human indifference. Do we not feel a visceral, righteous anger? What are we to do with such anger? For most of us, and especially those of us with universalist inclinations that find the idea of hell as unworthy of belief, there is little comfort in the idea that judgment and punishment await the guilty in the afterlife. Nor do we find much solace in hearing that what we see as injustice is simply part of God's plan, and we mere mortals are incapable of comprehending the bigger picture. What kind of divine plan could possibly demand the suffering of thousands, even millions of people to justify some ultimate good? Or even the murder of one innocent person? It is an obscene proposition by any reasonable ethical or moral standard. Even the tragic aftermath of natural disasters is hard for us to accept as, quote, God's will, except in the most extreme, abstract sense of the words. Pat Robertson may believe that God sent Hurricane Katrina to punish New Orleans for its wickedness, but this is a sad and, I would say, evil theology driven by his bigotry and homophobia. Apart from the suffering caused by natural disasters, disease, and just plain bad luck, we have to face the fact that human beings are the agents of both good and evil in the world. The only real angels and demons we really need to worry about. As people of faith, people of hope, we feel as angry and discouraged as anyone else at times. But we hold fast to the idea that ultimately the good will prevail. In the bigger picture, what we might call the God's eye view of history, we are steadfast in our hope for a better world. We work for justice in the present with the grace of believing in the celebrated words of Theodore Parker that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. We are sustained by the truths we have discovered in our spiritual journeys, or by simple faith in the potential for human goodness. Sometimes it is hard to keep up the good work when we acknowledge the reality that we will not always see justice prevail, no matter how long or how hard we strive. Our hearts break at the scale and depth of human depravity and the evil that surrounds us. It is difficult to hear the opening words today from Anne Frank, for example, when we know that she died in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp not long after she wrote them. How could she hold on to her faith in humanity in the middle of the Holocaust? In trying times, can we too look up into the heavens, soften our anger, and believe in our hearts that it will all come right? Some days I think I can, but to be honest, most days the future generally looks pretty bleak. A constant parade of violence and suffering, political corruption, and human indifference. And then I run across something in a book or article I'm reading or on the news or Facebook that renews my hope, at least a little. Maybe it is a story about someone just being nice or doing the right thing. And sometimes justice does catch up with the wicked one way or another. The lessons I take from Jonah are that even in the darkest moments, when we too cry out from the belly of Sheol, we must hold fast to hope. We must believe in our hearts that the arc of the moral universe does indeed bend toward justice, no matter how hopeless and cruel the world may seem. We may feel swallowed up and abandoned, and our spirits may begin to falter, but we must remain steadfast. And beyond our own despair, this is true when we reach out into the world to do the work of justice. The work is often hard, but it is work we must continue no matter what the world throws at us. But even if we do, we may not see the justice we desire. We may feel the frustration of Jonah. To be true to our liberal religion, we must hold to our principles and ideals and even be willing to forgive. Sometimes the way forward requires us to give up our right to demand justice, instead to offer forgiveness. It is human nature to feel the wicked should be punished, but it is also human nature to show mercy and compassion. Sometimes our perceived enemies will have a change of heart. Or it may be that a process of truth and reconciliation offers a brighter path to the future. It is so inspiring to see those who have every reason to hate and to seek justice against their wrongdoers instead choose a path of compassion and forgiveness. I will never forget the remarkable example of forgiveness set by the Amish families after the horrible murder of 5 young Amish girls at the West Nickel Mine School in Pennsylvania in 2006. Other children were injured, and the shooter took his own life in this tragic event. In the aftermath, the grieving families not only forgave the shooter, but reached out to his family to help comfort them in their own grief. How many of us could honestly do the same? I don't think I could have, at least not as quickly as they did, though I try to work on deepening my compassion. Though the shooter was already dead, like Jonah, I would have still likely cried out for justice to be served somehow. I pray that we Unitarian Universalists will always be willing to work for justice, to be champions of those who need our support, to side with love and hold fast to our principles. But let us also be willing to empathize with those who oppose us, to have compassion, to forgive, to strive also for mercy and grace. Our faith calls us to not only respect the inherent worth and dignity of others, but to love them, even our enemies, even those who oppose everything we cherish. There is so much fear and anger and divisiveness in our world today, especially it seems over the last few years in America. It is so tempting to give in to our frustrations and wish our enemies to get what they deserve. But there is also great freedom in letting go of this anger and allowing compassion to have the upper hand. Such faith offers a genuine hope that the world needs desperately. We are called to envision a better world, a beloved community. And every time someone decides to act on this vision, it is an affirmation of hope. May it be so. I invite you to enjoy our closing hymn, number 108, My Life Flows On, an Endless Song.
My life flows on in endless song above earth's lamentation. I hear the real, though far off hymn that hails a new creation. Through all the tumult and the strife, I hear the music ringing. It sounds an echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing? What though the tempest round me roars? I know the truth, it liveth. What though the darkness round me close? Songs in the night it giveth. No storm can shake my inmost calm, while to that rock I'm clinging. Since love prevails in heaven and earth, how can I keep from singing? When tyrants tremble as they hear the bells of freedom ringing, when friends rejoice both far and near, how can I keep from singing? To prison cell and dungeon vile, our thoughts to them are winging. When friends by shame are undefiled, how can I keep from singing?
My favorite hymn. Our closing words come from the Reverend Theodore Parker. And though it is often quoted by the adaptation from Martin Luther King Jr. and others, this is the original source from 10 Sermons of Religion in 1853. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice.
Please join me in reading the words for extinguishing the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.